Dr. Atchison here. We're still talking about social and emotional development. This is our second lecture for Chapter 11 on emotional development. So the basic emotions were actually captured pretty well in the movie Inside Out. Joy, anger, disgust, fear, sadness. We also have interest, surprise, contempt, shame, and guilt as ones that were identified by Carol Izard. And these basic emotions are biologically determined. Some of these are even present at birth, and we'll talk about those in a second. These, however, are culturally universal in meaning and subjective experience. What will be culturally specific is when we're told that it's okay to express them. But the emotions themselves, these basic emotions themselves, are culturally universal, okay? And they're often experienced in blends. So my daughter watches or used to watch My Little Pony a lot. And Pinkie Pie, which is one of the characters, talks about being nervous, excited. That both nervous and excited kind of mix together. And that is the idea, is that these things aren't always discrete. We don't always feel just one thing. Sometimes we feel a combination of things, and sometimes it's more than just one thing. Again, it's blends or mixed emotions. So the development of emotional expression in infants in terms of their own expression is at birth we see distress, interest, and disgust. So these are three of the basic emotions that we see present at birth. And you'll see that these are really important for the infant's kind of survival and learning. So disgust is an important one in case something is gross or nasty or rotten or bad, that this is a kind of an emotion that's important for survival. Interest will allow infants to kind of attend to things so they can learn more about them, and distress allows them to communicate with their caregivers that they need something. So these three really have a really important basis, and we'll see that these are present at birth. Around 10 to 12 weeks is when we'll start to see those first social smiles. So prior to that, when you see a newborn and they look like they're smiling, they're like, oh, he smiled at me. No, sorry, he didn't. Not at a couple of weeks old. We really don't see that really emerge until 10 to 12 weeks, when it really is a reflection of some sort of interaction that they had with another person, a response to social interaction with another. We see that at about 10 to 12 weeks. At about 3 to 4 months, so we were talking about weeks, now we're talking about months, we start to see expressions of sadness and anger in infants. And around 7 months, we'll start to see expressions of fear. So we can kind of, there's a developmental progression to this. Self-conscious emotions are higher order emotions. So we talked about the basic emotions. Self-conscious emotions are such as guilt and shame and envy and pride. And each one of these involves either an injury or an enhancement to our sense of self. So if you feel pride, that is going to be an enhancement to your sense of self. If you feel guilt or shame, that's going to kind of injure your sense of self. And these don't really start to show up until about 18 to 24 months. And what's interesting about these is they're going to require that social piece. They're going to require adult instruction. These are just not things that kind of just develop kind of on their own. We need to know what we feel proud of. We need to know what we feel embarrassed of. In some cultures, a burp, a really loud belch, is something that you feel shame or embarrassment about. Where in some cultures, that is something you feel pride about. So again, these are not going to be, these self-conscious emotions are not going to be culturally universal. These are going to be more dictated and more functions of the cultural experience, the environmental experience. When infants start to recognize emotion in others, very young infants aren't good at this. Remember, we talked about facial processing in terms of the early infant abilities. And remember, at birth, infants are really scanning the outside of the head. They're paying attention to the hair. They're not scanning the internal features of the face. Well, if you're not looking at the internal features of the face, your hairline doesn't tell you much about how someone's feeling. And so until they can really scan and distinguish the changes of the internal regions of faces, really recognizing, distinguishing these changes in facial emotion can't even begin to take place. So we see that infants start to discriminate between smiling and frowning faces at about 6 weeks, which is pretty close to about when they're starting to scan those internal features of the face. So they start scanning the internal features of the face, and they can notice when that facial feature changes. So they're habituated to a smiling face, and then shown a frowning face, and they'll dishabituate to the frowning face, showing that they think that that frowning face is different. Now, they don't understand what the happy face, the smiling face versus the frowning face means yet, but they can detect those differences in facial structure. Not till about 5 to 6 months do we really see that infants start to get a clearer understanding of facial emotions in other people. We see this demonstrated in many different ways, one of which is preference for certain facial emotions. They'll prefer to look at certain facial emotions than other facial emotions. Infants will also mimic these emotions. They'll smile when they see a smiling face. And finally, there's a lot of evidence that they can categorize emotions as well. Categorize happy versus disgust faces. And this happens with different kinds of information. We see this is easier to do with moving faces than it is to do with still faces. And again, this will be evidence that this clearer understanding of facial emotion is really starting. And sometimes we don't really see this really finishing this categorization until closer to 10 months. But we can see some evidence of this starting to happen much younger. Now, again, emotion is, we have these basic emotions that are culturally universal. There's social rules about when we can express them. So there's social rules about when it's appropriate to be happy and when it's appropriate to feel sad and how much you're supposed to be able to express these emotions. So in Japan, for example, expression of negative emotions are strongly discouraged. And so we won't see as much negative emotion expression from individuals that have grown up in this Japanese culture, as opposed to a culture that doesn't have that cultural rule. So your book talks about this socialization of emotions and how it's different depending on the cultures as to what mediates what emotions are appropriate when. There's these emotional display rules, and we start to see older infants and preschoolers start to be able to talk about their emotions, but really to figure out when it's okay and the attitudes towards those emotions, we start to see those a little bit later depending on the culture. So again, when a culture says it's appropriate to display that emotion, they'll do that. When a culture says it's not appropriate, children will start to learn to mask those. A great example of this is boys don't cry. The idea that boys are told that boys don't cry, boys aren't supposed to experience this emotion. And we'll see that for a very, very long time, that was a huge emotional display rule in the U.S. culture. To the extent that my dad, who was born in 1945, for a long time told my mom he didn't have emotions. And it wasn't until my mom said, "But don't you love us?" And he said, "Well, yeah." And she was like, "Well, that's an emotion." And he kind of head exploded. So there's these cultural expectations of when it's appropriate. And these can be fluid too. We see that expression of boys' emotions is changing. We're allowing a lot more flexibility in young boys expressing emotions and men expressing emotions than we used to, which in my opinion is a good thing. But we'll see differences in this based, again, on the culture. And so differences in emotion then between genders or between cultures are not going to be a function of genetic differences. They're going to be a function of that emotional that environmental component that's telling them when it's okay to display these different emotions. The last thing I wanted to talk about isn't developing until later childhood and adolescence, and this is really that emotional self-regulation. And this is strategies that we do to adjust our emotional state. So if we're sad, how do you deal with that? How do you make yourself not sad anymore? It doesn't feel good to be really, really sad. You want to be at a comfortable level of intensity so you can get stuff done. So how do you modify that? And again, this is a function of effortful control. How do you voluntarily manage your emotions? And effort control starts a lot earlier than really coming up with strategies to adjust our emotional state. And we really see that this is related to development of the cerebral cortex. So when areas of the brain are kind of have us ready to do these things, we'll start to be able to see that this happens with children and adolescents. So this ends our lecture about emotional development. Thanks.